Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, San Francisco's premier author interview program. Today we are going to talk about a novel called The Poet of Tolstoy Park, and it's published by Ballantine Books. But the most important thing about this book is that the author, Sonny Brewer, who is with us in the studio today, has crossed over, if you will, to the other side of the book business. Mr. Brewer, tell us what you usually do for a living.
I own a bookstore, an independent bookstore called Over the Transom Books in Fairhope, Alabama, down on the Gulf Coast.
Okay. So you got sick of selling them, and you decided you'd write one. I really think it's kind of an exciting move for you, isn't it?
It is exciting, and it's different. I think maybe it's going to help that I know some of what's behind these author signings and appearances. And how much work it takes to keep a book alive in today's marketplace.
Yeah. You know, the other thing that kind of interested me was you have what I would call a rather diverse and somewhat checkered past, jobs that you've had. There's a list of them here, and there's one that I'm really intrigued with because I have no idea what it means. It says at one time in your life you were a pants folder.
I worked for Tom and Huck Toggs in Columbus, Mississippi.
Okay.
I showed up for work the first morning, and they put me on a station where it was my job to take a pair of new pants and fold them. I worked until the first break at 9, and I went outside, and I never came back. It was a brief job, my shortest job.
You made it to the first break. And
I made it to the first break.
One of the other things it says in here is that you were a traveling used tire salesman.
I have an uncle in Vernon, Alabama, who bought tires. This was back in the late 60s, early 70s. He bought tires on the wheel from wrecking yards in Chicago.
Okay.
So it could be a new tire off of a wrecked car.
Sure.
And so he put those on a truck, and I drove the truck unannounced to gas stations and tire stores and repair shops all over Alabama and Mississippi, and got out and said, "Can I sell you some used tires, sir?"
In addition to all that, he also has a literary background. He's the editor of the acclaimed annual anthology series, Stories from the Blue Cafe, Anthologies of Southern Writers, and the series editor of a new anthology, The Alumni Grill, each installment featuring a guest editor. And he has written and published 3 books of his own, Rembrandt the Rocker, an illustrated parable on aging that poses as a children's book, Yin for Change, a book of dime store philosophy, and a ghost-written biography of Clarence Darrow. And Clarence Darrow plays a role in the current book.
Yes.
And he's in the prologue to the book in a kind of fascinating way, and then he comes back in at the end. And it seems to me that a lot of interesting people pass through that small town that you're from and are writing about.
It is an interesting town, and some of the ones who passed through there early, like 60, 80 years ago, among them were Clarence Darrow and Sherwood Anderson, who lived in Fairhope for 6 months. John Dewey came to town to visit a school there. A lot of famous people, and now we have in Fairhope, a little town of 15,000 people, probably more published writers per capita than probably anywhere. Winston Groom, Fannie Flagg, W.E.B. Griffin,
Woo.
Terry Klein, Judith Richards, Joe Formicello. I could go on and on.
And Sonny Brewer.
And now Sonny Brewer.
Sonny Brewer.
Now Sonny
the
Brewer.
novelist. No, okay. Wasn't in the novels before. He was a pants folder, crying out loud. The Mr. Henry Stuart, I mean, once you get into this, you understand why you would write a novel. But I guess the question ought to be asked, why a novel rather than a biography?
You know, when I first learned about Henry Stuart, it was that I saw this crazy round concrete house that he built 80 years ago with 6 windows and a door, with a dome-shaped roof, slathered over with concrete also. It looked for all the world like something from Middle Earth.
Did it have the hammock in it when you saw it?
No, it did not have his
Okay.
bed in it at that point.
Okay.
But I was drawn to the man, and so I learned some things about him, some of the details, the facts, as it were, of his life. And pretty soon I decided that what I wanted was not to chase after the letter of the man's biography. What I wanted was to try to capture the spirit of the man, because it was with his spirit that I felt a certain affinity and an understanding. So I wanted to portray his spirit, not the letter of his biography.
The kind of job that you did and how successful it is witnessed by Rick Bragg, who says you write the way people think and talk, and of course those people are poets. He writes like a man who knows things, the down-earth things of life. And when we come back, I'm going to do something because I want to do it. This is the kind of book that I think you can open to almost any page and read out loud, and you're going to capture some great writing. We'll do that when we return.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
The author today is Sonny Brewer. The book, The Poet of Tolstoy Park, a novel published by Ballantine Books, and we were sharing a little bit of what Rick Bragg had to say about your book. I want to go on with that. He continues, I love this book because I love to read and because I love to write, and I envy the skill in this as much as I love the story that the writer's skill embraces. This book wraps its arms around you, rubs its face against you with a stubbled cheek, and refuses to let you go. And it's what it is. And I think the proof of that is that you can open it up at almost any place and read from it, and you say kind of, wow, this has really got it. John McAllister's daughter Ruth had returned his boots, but Henry walked barefoot more and more often, particularly on the longer trips to town. A chill September wind snapped at the trees, tore loose the first crisp yellow leaves, and invited sweaters and heavier sleeves down from the closet shelves. But the sun would not be intimidated and shone brightly upon the ground. Henry's toes and the balls of his feet found the warmth there in the soil, and the fire in the earth coursed up his calves and thighs into his belly and settled in his chest, warming his breathing, relaxing the muscles of his shoulders and neck so that he did not withdraw into his collar from the whistling wind. Now that's a description of somebody walking down the street in his bare feet on a fall day in Idaho.
In the 1920s.
In the 1920s. And you get it all. I mean, the little things like getting the sweaters down from the shelves, and the wind whistling, and the wind having the power, and yet the sun is still there. And I loved it.
The feeling the sun from over his head and the warmth in the soil, even though it was a chilly day, was important to me as I thought about Henry Stuart, because he had consumption, tuberculosis, and his doctors told him he had only a year to live, and so that's when he tossed his boots away and began walking barefoot all over town. And I thought to myself, for an old man to walk around barefoot, that there would be something curative and healing maybe that he could feel in the warmth of the soil.
Energy coming up from the earth. Yeah. Now, one of the things he decides to do, a kind of prescriptive that he read in the book someplace or a magazine, is go south, old man, and you'll feel better. And that means that he has to separate himself from his two sons and his best friend, Reverend
Will Webb, a Baptist preacher.
Right, with whom he rarely agrees, but loves to discuss and argue. And those are the people, four of them, in a train station in Dubuque. And this is the scene. Each man in the group was an island, and together they were an island, shrouded in calm and mystery and set in the station's frantic and confused sea. An onlooker would wonder and speculate what story bound these four men together in their collective solemnity. For though they were certainly members of the same party, none would look at the other. That Henry would probably never lay eyes on his sons or his friend again, and would in minutes step onto this train and ride off into a morning's eternity, stole completely from him and from his companions the gift of language. There was simply nothing more to say.
Indeed, and he was leaving them, and he was going away to Alabama. He had never been to Alabama, and this is not a mystery, so I can say that he never returned to Idaho. He left for good. His sons, his friend, his home, his belongings, his money.
So that the solemnity of parting and the inability to speak is very appropriate, because it was turns out to be a final parting. And I think that's so real. When partings are difficult, you run out of words.
Mm-hmm. Or you babble on saying silly things because you're embarrassed and awkward in the moment.
Right. Now he gets on the train, and anybody who gets on a train to take a long ride is going to sit at that window and look out, and you're able to tell us what he sees in a way that I think is simply magnificent. The Union Pacific Twilight Limited, clackety-clack, steaming away from the setting sun on a promise to meet again at dawn, swaying on the silver rails as if a mother's hand had hold of the passenger coach in which Henry rested his forehead against the cold glass window. The painted sands and menacing mountains of the western landscape, its inscrutable devil rock spires, its scrubby pines and thin brown grasses, its horizon to horizon sky seemed carted off like abandoned set props in a madly paced theatrical dreamscape. And he's seeing the changing landscape. And I'd probably sit at the window and say, oh, my God, there goes the mountains, and now we don't have them anymore. That's gorgeous writing. That's all there is to it. So in The Poet of Tolstoy Park, Henry Stuart's well-thought-out plan to be a recluse fails. But from this failure, he discovers a self he probably never knew. Now we're going to explain that complicated sentence when we return.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email JimFosterCoc@gmail.com.
This is Jim Foster. This is Conversations on the Coast. Our guest today, Sonny Brewer. His book, a novel, The Poet of Tolstoy Park, published by Ballantine Books, about which Jennifer Paddock, the author of A Secret Word, has, in part, I guess, could have been longer, this to say. The Poet of Tolstoy Park is as vibrant as the Alabama eastern shore of its setting. And that's very important, the setting, the whole nature of how people think and do things down there is really captured in your book. And as enigmatic as its central character, the pilgrim prophet poet Henry James Stuart. What Sonny Brewer has written magically is one hurricane of a novel, wrecking all our fears and assumptions of death and dying, then leaving us with the rare gift of calm. The kind of calm one associates with cherished land or graceful language or a long life lived well. In essence, what Brewer has delivered is a handbook on how to die rightly by living. All right, let's get to it. The main theme, the main plot line of this book is Mr. Stuart's wanting to experience his death in, I guess, what he would call an appropriate, a deep way. And that's one. And he goes south. Because it's warmer there.
When his doctor told him that he would die, some of us we don't know it's coming, but he was told he had about a year. So he was a man who had studied religion. In fact, he had a degree in divinity from Mount Union College, class of 1888.
And he was in like a seminary there? Or yeah.
In the seminary. Mm-hmm. And a thoughtful, contemplative man faced with the biggest idea of all, that you are dying. Though we all know we're going to die, I am and you are, but he was faced with it in such a way, your death is coming at this approximate time on the calendar. And so he decided that he wouldn't walk away from dying, and he wouldn't sit in fear of it and tremble. He would face it, and in an interesting way, inasmuch as he decided what he would do would be to work, to bend his back in labor, to craft concrete blocks, and to make a round house with only a year to live. Why would you want to build a round house, But he decided that work was as good as anything to do with what time he had left. Maybe he'd had enough of chasing high ideas. Maybe he'd had enough of writing philosophical entries into his journal and said, you know what, I'm just going to bend my back and I'm just going to work. I'm just going to stir some concrete and walk around barefoot. And that's in fact what he did.
This is an idea he got from an ex-brother. Not a Capuchin, what kind of brother?
From Gethsemane in Kentucky, a Trappist monk.
Yeah. At a certain point in the story, and I think it's the most powerful moment in the story, I think I could say that he comes to the realization that maybe that's not enough. Now, the brother said that the working, the doing, is enough. It is your life and can be your death. But at a certain moment in the book, it comes to him somehow, and I'm not sure in my reading how, that's not enough. There's another hurricane hitting them in this place in Alabama, and instead of weathering it alone, he gets up and decides he has to go to town and help the people there. That's transformative.
That's exactly the moment when the whole story changed. It was that, as far as he knew, he had just a little time to live. His lungs were burning.
Yeah.
He had coughed blood into his handkerchief. And even so, as badly as he felt, in as much pain as he was, he knew that there were people whom he had shunned for more than a year while he was building this hut who needed his help. So he decided to get out of his shell, to walk in the middle of a hurricane, to stumble, to fall, trying to get to his friends and neighbors down on that bluff to see what he could do to help them during this hurricane.
The result of that to him personally is a reduction to the point of absence, I suppose we would call it remission, of the symptoms of his tuberculosis. So that he lives a rather long life from that time and becomes, I don't know, I can't think of a word, a force, a presence in the town.
Indeed. Somebody who more than 1,000 people visited over a 6-year period, among them Clarence Darrow 6 times.
6 times Clarence Darrow, and there were others in this notebook.
Everybody came to see Henry Stuart. Maybe they knew that he was supposed to die and did not, and they were amazed by this fellow who lived for 25 more years.
You should get to meet Henry Stuart. You can do it easily. Get yourself a copy of The Poet of Tolstoy Park, a novel by Sonny Brewer. This has been Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at Jim Foster COC and email jimfostercoc@gmail.com.